Chapter 30. Aranya's mind stuttered to a complete halt. "Beautiful?" said a woman's voice. "Yeah, one of Kai's girls from the academy." "So beautiful," Kai repeated. More kissing sounds followed the words, then a giggle. "You came back for me," said Jia. "She Kai who never goes back to the same girl. What did you tell me once? I never play the same game twice. Weren't those your very words?" Darkness chuckled in response. "Prove interesting enough, and perhaps I'll make an exception to my rule." "You arrogant, preening peacock." The way Jia said it, it sounded more like a compliment. "I'll assume, then, that this is your apology for kissing that swoon girl?" Kai's devilish smirk was audible. "I apologize for nothing, love." Standing alone in the dark, bereft of her beloved grandfather, those careless words should have cut like a knife through Aranya's heart, carved it out, and served it up on a platter. But they didn't. Her heart still beat in her chest, albeit a ragged rhythm. Her mind twisted and turned over the things Leigh had said, the things that the seer, Tai Fu, had said. It was the magic. It fed on her insecurities, her fears. This wasn't an illusion. It was a manifestation of her worst fears. That she would lose her grandfather, that it would be her fault, that it would be because she left him. That Kai would grow tired of her, that his kisses and flirtations had no depth or meaning, that he would betray her the moment she admitted herself in love with him. That she would be alone. Alone in the dark, with no escape and no hope. Yeah, even Kai. They weren't real. They were only illusions. But if her fears manifested around her, then she could face them head on. She could look them in the eyes, hold them by the scruff, and tell them to eat dragon scat. Aranya got to her feet, her armor clinking loudly. "Come on, Kai. You should know that no girl wants to be kissed in a dungeon. You should also know that no girl wants to hear about other girls while you're kissing her." Around her, the air shifted. Her limbs suddenly lightened, like she'd been dragging a ball and chain behind her this whole time, and she'd just used the key to unlock it. But spouting off at an imaginary Kai was one thing. Walking out of here without her caged grandfather was another. Was she sure this was not real? That Na Lim Qigong hadn't done something to him? That Yang hadn't? That he was still safe at home, curled up with his tail wrapped around his pink nose by the hearth? Was the entire nightmare false, or was that one piece of it true? Could she risk believing it to be false? Could she risk leaving here without her grandfather? Would she go home to Tsushui only to find the nightmare at Fang's fortress was reality? This magic surrounding her, permeating the stone and the iron and earth, was pure evil. Of that, she was absolutely certain. Her heart pounded, her hands slick as a mossy river stone. Eyes open or closed, it made no difference. She was utterly blind. Yeah, she whispered. Her voice broke, but she summoned it again, this time stronger than before. "Forgive me if I'm wrong. Oh!" A sob caught in her throat. The pain in her heart was so sharp, she could have believed she plunged her own talons into her chest. But then Aranya marched, resolve firming in her heart. She faced the pitch blackness, the swirling evil in the air. She had a mission to accomplish. No matter the lies that surrounded her, she wouldn't believe them. She would rescue the wielders who had found themselves imprisoned in this hellish place. It didn't matter how her limbs trembled, or how weak she felt, or how hard it was to fight the groping fear. She would see this through to the end.
When Kai met back up with Zhenshu, he was half-carrying an emaciated prisoner, with two more behind him. Zhenshu had found two prisoners, one of whom was in better shape, like himself, but the other looked like a walking corpse. "That should be everyone," Zhenshu said. Kai nodded, swiftly turning on his heel and herding his group of prisoners up the stairs. He didn't want to talk to the man who'd just been kissing Aranya. It didn't matter that it was only to break a curse. He was determined to be wounded and petty, which he thought was reasonable, considering the phoenix-scorched mess of a situation they were in. As much as he didn't want to talk to Zhenshu, and would prefer leaving the man in the dark, he muttered begrudgingly, "You and Aranya can watch the prisoners while I evanesce down to the tunnel to get a read on the situation." He was actually telling someone his plans. Delan would be so proud. Kai scowled. Informing someone of his plans meant he was bound to stick to them. Kai ended up following Zhenshu's nose back to where Aranya guarded the prisoners. He swallowed his fear, telling himself Zhenshu's keen senses would likely have picked up any significant disturbances, like a battle. There was nothing to worry about. Aranya could hold her own. Zhenshu, apparently trying to lighten the mood, said, "I assume you are well acquainted with Aranya?" Annoyance prickled down Kai's spine. The prisoner clinging to his shoulder chose that time to pitch forward, and Kai had to react swiftly to catch him before he smashed his brains out on the unforgiving ground. "Yes, we are well acquainted," said Kai. "She's sniper level with that Jian." The appreciation was obvious in his voice. And despite his determination to be jealous, Kai smirked. "She's just as good with a sling." "Really? Nobody's good with a sling these days. They practice shooting with their Jians instead." "I saw her hit this brigand once with a shot from her sling at some 70 or so paces, straight to the belly." Zhenshu let out a laugh. "Wish I could have seen it." "Sure you do," Kai muttered under his breath, back to being sour again. "Here we are," said Zhenshu, reaching a door and moving to open it. Almost as quickly, he froze. "What?" Kai demanded, shoving his clingy prisoner to one of the stronger ones. "I can't smell her. She's not here." He was already opening the door, but Kai evanesced into the room. The woman prisoner was sprawled on the ground, unconscious, but the man was awake. He swayed on his backside, hands over his ears as he muttered something unintelligible under his breath. He seemed utterly oblivious to the fact that his rag-like pants had split. "Where is she?" demanded Kai, evanescing to the man's side and pulling one of his hands away from his ear. "Where did the shifter go?" "It's the magic! It's the magic!" he cried, bowing his head toward his knees as if to hide. "Don't hurt him, Kai," said Zhenshu. "I'm not hurting him," snarled Kai. But he let go of the man's wrist. "What magic? Where is she?" "He must mean Fang's magic." Kai whirled, his stomach plunging to the floor. "Fang's magic." His voice came out in a croak. Memories of shadowy black manacles, chaining his hands above his head, flooding his mind. Zhenshu's face had gone pale, grim. "Is she prisoner then?" Kai demanded. "Did Fang find her? How do we—" "I don't know!" Zhenshu said, cutting him off with a growl as he readjusted the prisoners on his shoulders. "But with your magic, you could find her faster than anyone. I'll take the prisoners to the tunnel." "By yourself?" Kai might dislike Zhenshu, but not that much. "With all of them?" "I can fight too," said the strongest prisoner, one eyebrow lowered in a glower. "See?" said Zhenshu, with a crooked grin. "We've got this. Go find Aranya, and then come join us." After grinding his teeth and warring with his sense of responsibility, Kai nodded and told them where the tunnel was. He didn't wait to watch Zhenshu toss the incapacitated prisoners over his shoulders, as his mottled crew began their escape. He was already evanescing away with his torch, calling Aranya's name into each chamber he entered, and trying not to let his imagination spiral out of his control. "Don't lose your head. Don't lose your head," For all he knew, Fang hadn't caught her. She could have just been making her escape, like he told her to. She was probably fine. But the longer he searched, the more frantic he grew, and the more clearly he saw her. The haunted turn of her eyes, the misery filling her soul when she'd come out of that night-darkened forest alone and ran into his arms. She was alone, probably terrified out of her wits. And all these festering, dragon-blasted chambers were empty! Spitfire, said Kai, cursing vehemently. Spitfire! Aranya! Movement caught his eye, made him turn. The form that emerged from the darkness into the flickering ring of his torchlight wasn't the short, strong frame he desperately hoped it was. Instead, it was one even more familiar. A tall, masculine form, one that mirrored his own. Young, Kai spat. Question after question hurled through his mind, but he refused to give voice to them. Showing ignorance was showing weakness, and he never let his brother see his weakness. Kai, said his older brother, the faintest curve of a sardonic smile playing at the corner of his lips. What a game this has become. You always loved games. Game. It was only then that Kai noticed the changes in Young's stance. The way he kept his hands by his side. The way the darkness seemed thicker here. So thick, it almost obscured the edges of his flesh to Kai's view. Forget hiding his weaknesses. Kai evanesced to his brother, grabbed the front of his robes with one fist, and yanked him closer. He channeled every ounce of the dripping venom that ran in their sheer blood. You did something to her, didn't you? Shui, was it? A warden? Really, Kai? But you were the one always gifted in disappearing under people's noses, weren't you? Young grinned, an absolutely garish grin, his eyes glittering. Smoothly, he lifted his hand and flicked Kai's nose. My evasive little brother. But I have you now, don't I? The knife was flashing between them, pressing into the soft flesh of Young's throat. What did you do to her, brother? Another evanescer would have vanished away from the blade. But not Young. No. He only grinned wider and cocked his head to one side. She's trapped right now, in a magical nightmare of Fang's concocting. If you come back with me to Gabe, if you take your rightful place as Lord of the Hidden Ones, I'll let her go. I won't even harm her. I'll even be certain to get her out of this fortress. Alive. Of course you would. You can't kill the only leverage you have on me. Young's mouth twisted, the realest part of his mock smile. I know you too well, brother. You cannot pretend she means nothing to you. She's different. Different from all the rest. And you would do anything for her. Kai sheathed the knife, despite how empty his hands felt when he did. He had to play this carefully if he was to get Aranya out of this. Counting on his twitching fingers, he began dryly. Things I would not do for Aranya. 1. Commit treason. 2. Murder. Though, there might be 1 or 2 exceptions to that. 3. Kiss your backside. Young snarled. His hand flung out in a wide arc, a fast one, and Kai barely evanesced out of the way. Quit with the games. Everything's a game, Kai snarled in response. And I know exactly the one you're playing. You'll spare her life, but you'll keep her under your thumb. You'd have me accept my inheritance, and then Aranya would be the string by which you, the puppeteer, would work me, the puppet. I might be named Lord of the Hidden Ones, but you would be the true master. So yes, I would like her free and away from here. But it will be on my terms, not yours. Never yours. With that, both brothers vanished, reappeared, and the battle was begun.
Chapter 31.
Kai unsheathed his broadsword the same moment Young did. They circled the dark room, eyes never blinking away from the other. I've told you before, Kai growled. I will be no one's puppet. You cannot make me, and neither could our wretched father. How dare you speak of him so? Oh, and neither can our heartless mother. She had a heart, if you would have stopped running long enough to see it. But now, had? Kai's voice faltered. The expression that passed over Young's face was a terrifying thing. It was made of raging forest fires, the blood of broken hearts, and the flint of an iron-wrought soul. You haven't heard. Heard what? 2 words. She's dead. Dead? No. That couldn't be. She'd been strong when he'd last seen her. She'd been everything his horrible mother had always been. I don't know what you mean, Kai said stupidly. She's been dead for weeks, you Chilin spawn. If you hadn't run, you would have known. You should have been there with her. She's gone because of you. You made her sick. Kai's steps faltered. He was so sick, he might vomit. It took everything to focus on Young, a mere few paces away, their swords between them. He wanted to throw down his weapon and walk away, to find a darkened corner to swallow him up. Aranya. This was about her, about finding her. This wasn't about his past, or his mother, or his broken family. This was about fighting with every ounce of strength in him for the one good and beautiful thing in his life. Young's teeth flashed. I am done losing everything I care about to you. That was when Young finally vanished. Kai slammed himself back against the wall, his instincts flaring as he searched for that telltale glimmer. Young's most hated magical trick. They both had them. But in typical Young fashion, he waited to strike. Waited, not reappearing, wanting Kai to let down his guard and turn his face away, as if Kai would abandon the wall and leave his back exposed. There! Kai evanesced, swinging his sword at the same moment that faint muddling of the air gave away Young's reappearance. But Young ducked, vanishing again. This time, he didn't wait to reappear, and Kai didn't have time to get his back against a wall. Sword clashed against sword, parry and block. I suppose this was bound to happen, Young growled. They both disappeared at the same time, reappearing on opposite sides of the room. In one swift movement, Young withdrew a knife and flung it. Kai only barely evanesced behind him, slicing with his sword. But Young didn't waste time spinning on his heel. He evanesced to Kai's side and thrust his sword straight towards Kai's chest. This is not my fault, replied Kai, dodging the blow. You hate me for reasons outside of my control, and I hate you for reasons entirely inside your control. Are you this arrogant with her? Young snarled. He vanished, this time not reappearing. He loved that trick, the suspense it accommodated. He wanted Kai shivering in his boots, wondering where he would reappear next. But Kai didn't have time for stupidity. Ladies love confidence, Kai said, forcing a wicked grin onto his face as sweat slid down his temples. Still, Young did not reappear. Kai could almost feel the palpable displeasure in the air. You should try it sometime, Kai drawled. Maybe a girl will finally notice you. Young smashed into Kai's chest, slamming him into the wall. Kai evanesced away. but not before he let out a loud, "Oof!" His sword darted out, taking advantage of Young's fury. But Young wasn't as distracted as he appeared, and with a quick clip of his sword, Kai's blow was deflected. "I hate you," said Young, evanescing to stand with his back against the opposite wall. "The sentiment is mutual," drawled Kai. "Your father had just—" "Indeed. Then you'd be able to fully express the monster you are." In startling succession, Young reappeared to Kai's left, then right, then left again, letting loose wild, lightning-sharp blows. Kai could only barely deflect the first and second blows. On the third, he couldn't change momentum that quickly. He evanesced, but Young evanesced with him, hammering him relentlessly. Evanesce, strike, evanesce, strike, strike, dodge, evanesce. As much as Kai hated to admit it, he couldn't get the advantage. Neither of them could. And all he could do was provoke Young into a further rage. But instead of making Young clumsier, it made him sharper, more bloodthirsty. The hatred shining in Young's eyes ran even deeper than Kai's, and it had burned for longer. Since the moment Kai had been born, they'd been sworn enemies. "I'll leave her in the nightmare," snarled Young. "It'll kill her. The magic will consume her mind and soul, and if there's anything left of her body, it'll disintegrate like burned parchment." "You'll free her," Kai growled back. "You need her." But Young's eyes glowed, glittering blacker and blacker. And suddenly, Kai wasn't so sure. He remembered those cursed bonds, the wretched compulsion that nearly forced him to kill Aranya. "I'm sure Feng could whip something up for me," Young said coldly between blows. "Something that might make you more receptive to my bidding." Those spellbound phoenixes burned in his mind, the feeling of the dagger in his fist as the tip pierced Aranya's flesh. No, if Young had any leverage with Feng, which he probably had, considering the forces he provided him with, then— "I'm not letting her out," said Young. "Hope you kissed her goodbye." They were nearly chest to chest, the blades of their swords the only things between them. Kai refused to look away from his brother's eyes, refused to back down from the whirls of intensity, emotion, and hatred. He faced it, pushing back with all his might. Then, a sharp twang. Young's eyes went wide with sudden shock and pain. Kai evanesced away, expecting a trick. But when he reappeared a few feet away, he was stunned by the sight he saw. An arrow pierced Young's gut, blood darkening his robes and slipping through his armor. One arrow, not two. And there was Aranya, standing in the doorway of the third opening at the far side of the chamber, staring furiously down the sights of her Jian. Had he died? Was he imagining things? Young said she was trapped. Yet here she was, her hair a wild shock of black, her face smudged and ever bruised. And her eyes. She was different. She was not the whimpering girl who'd fallen into his arms for comfort. No, this was a dragon slayer standing before him, a proven warrior, and a phoenix blasted good shot of a warrior too. Aranya's eyes flew wide, her hands already flying to reload. "Kai!" she screamed. Kai evanesced, Young's knife hitting the wall where he'd been a moment ago. His brother gasped, grimacing and bowing over against the stairs, hand clutching his stomach. "I hate you both," he snarled. He vanished. The air changed in a flash. It was no longer the expectant hovering when Young waited to reappear, no longer pregnant with the disembodied soul of another. It was clear, brighter, if a dungeon could ever be called clean. Across the room, Aranya's eyes met his. They swam with far too much emotion to name, And there, hiding behind her strength, was a wisp of the fear that had haunted her these last few weeks. But she blinked, and that wisp was gone. "He could reappear at any minute," she said, breaking into a run toward the stairs. "I don't know how badly he's injured. I didn't want to kill him if you didn't want me to, but I was afraid he'd hurt you, so I shot." Kai sheathed his sword and evanesced in a flash. He reappeared in front of her, cutting off her escape. Before she could do or say anything else, he knocked aside her jian, grabbed her armored shoulders, pushed her against the wall, and kissed her. For the first heartbeat, she seemed too surprised to react. Then she softened, even as the metal of their armor clanged together. But almost as quickly, she growled and shoved her fist against his chest. 7 Valleys. When would she ever just kiss him? "Stop being such a—" She trailed off, gesturing vaguely at him. "We have to get out of this fortress, idiot! Besides, girls don't like being kissed in a dungeon. You should know that. And I'm mad at you." Her voice trembled slightly, just enough to reassure him that she wasn't wholly unappreciative of the kiss. Kai stared at her, brow wrinkled. "Why are you mad at me? For trying to—" She grabbed his arm, dragging him behind her up the stairs. "For kissing Jie and telling her that she was beautiful?" "I have never told Jie that she was beautiful." "For kissing her!" 7 Valleys, what are you talking about? I've never even kissed her." She glared back at him, a look that told him she was unconvinced. But how else was he to respond to these nonsensical charges she was flinging in his face? She spun on her heel to march up the stairs. "Aranya," he growled, catching up to her short, swift strides. "We might be stuck here, and then we might die. And I'm not sure why you're mad at me, but can't we talk it through? You can leave whenever you want." He evanesced in front of her, snatching her face between his hands and tilting it up to look at him. "I'm not leaving you," he said. His voice caught, quavered, and he hated himself for how suddenly the sharp emotion welled up. He swallowed, gritting out fiercely, "I'm not leaving you." He has never meant anything so much in his entire life. She stared up at him, eyes wide, dark, and rounded on the edges. She seemed to be searching, almost wrestling with herself. What did she fight? Why did she struggle? Her eyes closed, her eyebrows shuddering, and then little tears ran onto his thumbs. "I'm not leaving you," he said again, huskier this time. "Aranya, Yes," she said. The tone of her voice, the slight faltering, told him she was perhaps afraid of what he was about to say. But there was a desperation lacing those soft timbres, like she had to know. "I can't do this with your helmet on," he growled. She blinked, not moving. So he wrenched his own off, his messy hair flying everywhere, then grabbed hers and removed it much gentler. Her throat bobbed, eyes widening, her mouth parting more with each passing second. Once those stupid helmets clanked around on the floor, he swallowed every fear rising up in his chest, trying to wrangle control of his words. He would not be undone. They might not come out of this, and he wasn't leaving things unsaid between them. Crossing the distance between them, he gently, very tentatively, pulled her into his arms. For possibly the first time ever, she didn't resist. Her cheek was wet against his fingers. He used his sleeve to dab the wetness away, then tilted her chin up to him. Her pulse pounded against his touch. Was this possible? Did she want this as much as he did? He wanted to tell her through a kiss, but that wouldn't be enough. Not for her. Not when she was rightfully skeptical of him. But surely, by now, she knew. Surely she couldn't deny it further. He'd made it as obvious as the sun at noon. He rested his forehead against hers, caught her shuddering gasp in response. His hand shook, but he refused to back down, refused to let this moment go, even if the world was burning around them. "Swan Aranya," he whispered. His voice broke. "Don't you know that I love you with the very beat of my soul?"
Chapter 32. Aranya never thought those words would ever come out of Kai's mouth. I love you. Not that long ago, she'd been trapped in a nightmare where Kai was kissing Jia. But now he held her so tenderly, as though afraid she would spook at the slightest noise. And he said that. I don't know what this means, she said. Her breath shuddered out of her mouth, and her whole body trembled. A part of her wanted to spout off about how she didn't want to be told that in a rotting dungeon. But Kai was searching her eyes, his darting back and forth between them, as though trying to catch every thought passing through her mind. It means I'm not leaving you now. Or ever, if we make it out of here. I mean, unless you really want me to, in which case, Aranya, will you not say anything else? I love you too, she blurted, without thinking. The ground rumbled around them, the dungeon shaking beneath their feet. Pebbles and bits of plaster fell to the ground, but Kai was grinning like an idiot. We've got to get out of here, Aranya gasped, trying to twist out of his arms. Before we die! One kiss? He asked, grinning sheepishly and looking about 10 years younger. We're about to die! All the more reason. With that, he captured her lips with his. That kiss swept through her, coupled with his declaration, and the weight of it nearly made her break down in tears. She flung one arm around his neck, and for the span of a heartbeat, kissed him back with every fiber of her soul. I love you, his kiss seemed to say. Something warm and sweet and safe bloomed inside her. I love you, Kai, she told him with her own kiss. Then she broke away, scooped up her helmet, and growled, We've got to get out of here. Where are the prisoners? Where's Zhenshu? They went to the tunnel, said Kai, retrieving his own helmet. Hopefully they're through by now. I suppose we'll find out. She was startled when something slid into her hand, and realized with a start that it was Kai's hand. He squeezed hers, smiling grimly down at her. Let's do this, Swan Aranya. She pursed her lips and squeezed his hand in response. By the time they reached the tunnel, Aranya understood why Kai had said things were bad. The main door to the dungeon was broken off its hinges, hanging limply to the side. Firelight, from torches, phoenixes, or a wild blaze she didn't know, flooded the main entry to the dungeon. Bodies littered the floor, bodies clearly identified as Junninghai wielders, brigands, and barbarian soldiers. But it grew worse the closer they got to the tunnel. When they reached the chamber, Kai immediately flung Aranya out of the doorway and evanesced. Arrows zoomed past them. They crouched by the doorway, her loading her jian, and Kai unsheathing his sword as boots hammered on the other side of the door. A barbarian guard poked his head around, aiming his bow straight for Aranya. She squeaked, flinging up hers, but before either of them could shoot, blood sprayed and his head went rolling. Kai knocked the dead guard down and then shouted, Now! She leapt to her feet, straight for the doorway. Kai vanished. She raised her weapon, then flung herself into the sights of whoever was in the chamber and looked for a target. Half a dozen barbarian guards stumbled over bodies of fallen Junninghai wielders and their own, and Aranya didn't hesitate to shoot. Her arrows landed true. Kai reappeared behind another guard, dispatching him, then evanescing to the next. She ducked behind the doorway, reloading, then leaned around and fired again. Footsteps behind her made her jerk around. More guards came pouring down the stairs toward her. Her eyes flew wide, realizing she had no cover. At the same moment, the guards spotted her. They pulled out their bows, some drawing their swords or knives. She shot the one pulling back his bowstring. There was no time for thought, no time for loading 2 Jian arrows. She smashed one into the left slot and fired. The arrow went wide, and she cursed as she reloaded. This time she hit her target, but it wasn't an instant kill. He cried out, stumbling to his knees. His comrades came for her even faster. "Kai!" she screamed, scrambling with her blocky, trembling fingers. "Kai!" He reappeared at the top of the stairs, eyes darting from her to the guards charging her. In a flash, he was cutting them down, giving her time to reload and fire again. More came running down the stairs. "They're caving in the tunnel," was the cry of the new guards. "Out of the way!" Caving in the tunnel? Across dead bodies, Kai's eyes snapped to Aranya's. He was thinking the same thing she was. Their only escape. Were they the only ones left? Who was caving in the tunnel? Was it their own wielders, leaving them behind for dead? Or Fang's forces? It didn't matter. She stumbled to her feet, reloading as she rounded the edge of the doorway into the other room. But Kai finished the rest of them off, and she raced toward the tunnel. With a garbled cry, she glanced back toward the pursuing guards, jumped, and gripped the stone to hoist herself up into the tunnel. Kai caught her around the waist and hauled her back. "We have no time!" she shrieked, pulling away from him. "We have to—" "It's too late!" he cried. "We can't make it all the way through." "Then you get out of here!" "How many times do I have to tell you that I'm not leaving you?" She looked up at him, not bothering to hide how distraught she was. "But Kai—" Just then, the walls of the tunnel started shuddering, trembling. Rocks around them fell, hitting her helmet and her armor. From inside the tunnel, dust started pouring out, filling the chamber they were in. "We've got to find another way out." Kai grabbed her hand and yanked her back toward the stairs, toward the oncoming guards. "Load your Jian!" "I'm so glad you're an Evanescer." "What?" he cried over the growing dim of the caving tunnel. "Nothing." They faced their opposition head-on, and if the guards had possessed magic, Aranya and Kai probably wouldn't have survived the fight up the stairs to the next chamber. But between her Jian and his evanescing, they escaped with their lives, gasping as they raced up through the trembling bowels of the fortress. They reached the top level of the dungeon, and Aranya wasn't sure if she was relieved or terrified. The night burned outside the open dungeon door, and for a second, she hesitated. Kai reached out, clasping her hand in his. "Together," he said, his face spattered with blood. "We can make it out." Then, swiftly, he grabbed the back of her helmet, pressed her against his armored chest, and whispered again, "I love you." It felt like a goodbye. Kai kicked aside the door, and they faced the world of Fang's fortress. A wall of smoke hit Aranya, and she coughed, stepping backward. "East wall," Kai was saying. "We've just got to make it over that fallen wall." Fires burned everywhere, bodies littering the ground. Bodies that were both human and monster. Not far from her, the charred remains of a cursed phoenix lay with a huge bolt through its heart. Aranya shuddered away from it, but didn't have time for pity. They'd been spotted. An arrow whizzed and stuck in the ground by her foot. Kai's eyes snapped wide, straight to where the arrow had flown from, the parapets. The sniper pulled back his bow for another shot, but Kai vanished before she could pull out her Jian. She ducked behind the unhinged door as another arrow came thwunking to the ground. A cry shot into the air, then stopped. Kai reappeared at her side. "That way," he called. They ran, straight into 4 armed brigands. It all happened so fast, Aranya could hardly think. Instinct took over. She was shooting, reloading, but then they were in too close range, and one of the brigands smacked his hands together and pulled them apart to reveal a fireball. That fireball came hurtling toward her. She threw herself to the ground, dodging and rolling up into a crouch. The ground beneath her began shifting, and it wasn't just the rumbling of the tunnel collapsing. One of the other brigands swept her hand in an arc, and the stones Aranya was standing on slid to the side. She stumbled, fell. Kai attacked the fire brigand. She couldn't watch. She was too preoccupied with trying to get her feet back under her while the ground kept moving. Another brigand snarled, baring her teeth, and before Aranya realized what was happening, she had shifted into a viper. "I hate snakes!" she screeched, rolling to avoid its bite. But the earth wielder kept shifting the ground beneath her, bringing her closer to the snake. Snarling, she whipped out one of her knives and, gripping the blade between her fingers, flung it straight at the snake. She missed, but was really close. The snake morphed, growing bigger, until a bear towered over her. "I hate bears, too!" she shrieked, lifting her jian in one hand and firing it at the earth wielder. Another miss. Ugh! She didn't have time to reload because huge claws came for her face. She flipped over backward, onto her feet, but just as she straightened, a voice shouted, "Duck!" Instinctively, she obeyed. The second after she did, she recognized the voice. The bear roared. When Aranya lifted her head, 2 arrows were lodged straight in the bear's head. It stumbled, then came crashing to the ground. "Oh, dragons!" she cursed, trying to throw herself out of the way. A hand grabbed her wrist and yanked her to safety just in time. "Delan!" Aranya cried, grinning despite her terror from pure relief. "You're here!" "Watch it," he said. In a flash, he reloaded and shot his jian over her shoulder. Kai reappeared beside them. For a fraction of a second, they stood there, staring at each other. Then the collapsed wall on the other side of the fortress, where other wielders were struggling to get out. Delan placed a hand on each of their shoulders. "Let's do this," said Delan. And then the 3 of them leapt into the fray again. Chapter 33. Delan in battle was a sight to be seen. Aranya could hardly track his movements. He was so swift, so calculated, so proficient. It was like he'd been born fighting. Even against brigands with stronger magic, it was like he knew exactly the best ways to defeat them. And she definitely couldn't keep track of Kai. He was never in the same place for more than a second, but every second was deadly. Meanwhile, she was furious that jians didn't load themselves. She was forced to duck behind rubble or shout for Delan to watch her back to reload. This time, as she grumbled about how useless her hands were when her adrenaline was exploding in her veins, she was startled when someone dodged around the same bit of rubble as her. "I hate this," said the newcomer. Aranya startled, shifting her hands into talons in an instant. But when her eyes met the startled eyes of the girl next to her lips parted. "Leigh," she said. "Aren't you that siren I arrested?" The girl's eyes widened with the same recognition. "Hey, you arrested me." But she didn't make a move to stab her in the heart or work a siren spell on her, and neither did Aranya lift a finger against her. How was she here? "You're one of Fong's brigands?" Leigh winced. "Well, it's complicated." "Shh, there he is. Duck." "Who? Fong?" "No, my captor. The person I'm trying to kill. Truce for now?" "Truce." "Good. Now shut up." Aranya clamped her mouth shut, then peeked out over the edge of the rubble. There, moving haltingly, but still fighting, was Shi Yong. "I shot him," Aranya said angrily. "He's supposed to be incapacitated." Just then, Yong looked up, and his lips twisted back in a snarl. She followed his gaze to where Kai stood, staring back at him from the nearby parapets. Neither moved toward the other. They simply stared. "This has to end tonight," she whispered. Kai hadn't told her if he wanted her to kill his brother, if she had the chance. She loaded her jian, then hesitated. He clearly hated his brother, but did he want him dead? Would he rather spend his future estranged and running, or take his brother's life? She didn't know, but somehow she knew one of them was dying tonight. She wasn't about to let it be Kai. Carefully, she lifted the weapon and angled the sights on her target. One more arrow, and she should have him. She wouldn't have a clearer shot. Just a pull of the trigger, and the mess with his family could be over. A cry rent the air, one nearby and one achingly familiar. She and Leroy whipped around, just in time to see a brigand smash Delon into the ground and lift a downward-pointing spear above his chest. "No!" Aranya screamed, just as the spear plunged down. She ripped her Jian up and fired. Didn't take precise aim, she didn't have time. She let her frantic, flaring instinct guide her hand. The arrows lodged true in the brigand, and Delon had time to roll out from under the falling spear. His face poured sweat, his mouth hanging open, but he gave a grim nod to Aranya and held up a hand. A silent thanks. For that bare second, she'd forgotten how to breathe. Oxygen came whooshing back into her lungs, rushing like an overwhelming torrent. She gasped. "Nice shot," said Leroy. But when Aranya glanced back to Young, fingers already busy reloading the weapon, he and Kai were fighting again. They vanished and reappeared, almost as if coordinated. Their fighting was like a dance to win, to kill. But neither could get the upper hand. Her gaze was pulled as though by an unseen force. Up, up, up. She stopped trying to aim at Young, but instead let her head tilt back until she saw a tall figure in black standing on the parapets. He surveyed the destruction, the waging war below, and she knew she'd seen that stance before. She'd seen it at the Mwagwe waterhole. That was Feng Tsedong. Aranya's John found a new target. Kai could hopefully handle his wounded brother. Carefully, she lined up the sights. He was so far away, but she was good with long shots. She could do this. Breathe. In. Out. She tried to calm herself, relax the tension in her shoulders, and steady her arm. One shot. That was all she had. Feng lifted his hands wide. His voice echoed across the destruction between them. "To me! Retreat! Retreat!" Aranya's finger froze on the trigger. Retreat? But wasn't Feng winning? Why were they retreating? She glanced around at the waging war, the Junninghai wielders fighting with barbarians and brigands alike. Magic flared, weapons sang out, and suddenly, she wasn't so sure Junninghai was losing. The enemy forces responded to Feng's call, and they broke away from their fights, running toward the west wall where Feng was. Determination seized her. Now or never. She had to get this shot right. If she took out their leader... Feng turned away from the edge. No! If he moved, was he about to leap over the edge of the wall? She fired. Feng disappeared over the wall, the arrow whizzing harmlessly over his head.
The moment Young broke away from Kai was the moment Kai panicked. Things were going better, improving, and then Feng himself called the retreat. They were winning! But Young kept fighting, as Kai expected. They locked swords, dancing around each other. Kai hated that they were so evenly matched. They were wearing themselves out. But this had to be settled now. They could never go back to the false propriety. Now, it was murderous hostility between them. And if Kai didn't win, Aranya would pay for it. So when Young's gaze snagged on something over Kai's shoulder, his heart plummeted to his gut. Young vanished away from Kai's grip, and his sword sliced through empty air. Where did he go? It wasn't to keep fighting him. It was to... He reappeared some 20 paces away, behind a huge chunk of stone wall that had fallen. His gaze fixed downward. Kai knew without a doubt that was where Aranya must be. Young raised his hand, and the knife glinted across the space between them. She's trained. She's an excellent fighter. The rationale broke off into a frantic pounding of terror. Kai evanesced, but the knife was already descending. It was almost in slow motion, the world made of syrup. He couldn't move fast enough. Aranya! He was just in time to watch Young plunge the knife into Aranya's gut, right between the plates of her armor, right where she had shot him. Aranya stared in shock at Young, utterly stunned. Had he surprised her? Or had she simply not believed him capable of such a swift blow to end her life? Young wrenched the knife out of the wound, and blood flowed, red and thick. Her head fell backward, her eyes rolling. Aranya, 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 Aranya! Aranya, no. Kai exploded, but Young was expecting him. Didn't think I'd actually kill her, did you? Young snarled, striking out with his sword, fast as a viper, even as he held his own wound. This is your fault for all your... There were no words. Kai stabbed, parried, thrusted the weapon at Young. For the first time, it was with the full intent to kill. There had always been a part of him that he held back, just a fraction, in the hopes that it wouldn't end this way. But now, there was no other option, except that Young was crafty, and he vanished, reappeared, and smashed Kai's knees out from under him. Kai buckled beneath his own weight, trying to land so he could roll, but Young evanesced to the air above him, falling and slamming him into the stone. Join her in the grave, little brother! Kai stared at the sword coming for his chest, and for a fleeting second, he didn't want to fight it. Not if Aranya... He couldn't even think. No, it's your turn, came a high-pitched voice from behind Young. Then, Kai watched, eyes rounded in horror, as the very same siren they had arrested back in Zushui stabbed Young through the back. He fell forward. Kai evanesced out of the way, just in time to watch his brother hit the ground. Dead. A shard of grief, so profound, stabbed into the depths of his soul. His brother, his blood, his entire family now, gone. But then, he was in motion, evanescing to Aranya's side. Panic latched onto him fully, but he didn't care. If there was ever a time to panic, now was it. Her eyes were closed, her mouth wrung in a grimace, her brow scrunched in pain, her hands pressed against the bloody wound. Was she still alive? Aranya! Aranya! He screamed. He slid to her side, hands trembling violently as he felt for a pulse. A loud whoop came from nearby. We did it! Was Delan's hurrah. We won! We dragon-blasted won! We... Oh, fathers. Delan stopped, frozen for an instant. Then he ran to them, flinging off his helmet and throwing it to the side. Is she still alive? He gasped. I can't tell. Kai choked. His hands were trembling so much he couldn't detect her pulse. There's a healer, one of the missing wielders. If we can get her to the healer, she can save her. Delan pried one of her hands away from her side and pressed his thumb into the hollow of her wrist. She's alive, but we must move quickly. Help me strip off her armor. Kai began fumbling with the buckles, cursing his wretchedly useless fingers. Delan glanced up then and spotted the siren girl standing over Young's body. Friend or foe, girl? He barked. Neither, she said. I'm free, at long last. Then get out of here, growled Delan. Carefully, they removed the breastplate, then the mail, and finally, her blood-soaked robes were accessible. We've got to staunch the flow as best we can and get her out of here, to a medic. Kai was already ripping off his own armor, then his tunic. Delan lifted her torso, eliciting a groan from her, and that sound made Kai's heart soar with hope. But then Kai wrapped the cloth around her midsection, and the sheer amount of blood sent his heart plummeting again. "Careful there," said Delan, as Kai knotted the cloth. "I am," he growled back. Once they had finished binding the wound as best they could, Kai scooped her up in his arms, and then they were making for the leveled east wall. "The retreat might have been a farce to lower our guard," said Delan, climbing through the rubble. Kai swallowed, his heart hammering. He glanced to the west wall, where the enemy forces were disappearing, and then around at the other Zhenninghai wielders, joining their flight for the east wall. At the moment, he didn't care one bit whether they'd won or not. He held Aranya's limp body closer, trying to avoid jostling her too much as he ran and dodged around debris. Oh, why couldn't he evanesce other people? He could be back at camp already. They could be saving her. "Don't let your thoughts spiral," Delan said, with a sideways glance at him. "Just keep moving, one step after the other." Kai bared his teeth, but he redoubled his pace, refusing to glance down again into the pained twist of her features. He had to keep his eyes on where he was going. By the time they reached the camp, his lungs were on fire, his legs wobbly as wet noodles, and his arms and back ached from carrying her. None of that mattered. Delan cleared the way to the medics, and after an eternity longer of waiting, Kai carried her, half stumbling, into the tent. Medics ran to his side, helping him to lay Aranya down on one of the pallets. "Where's the healer?" Kai demanded. "There's a healer. One of the missing wielders. Where is she? We need her now!" "Move aside. We need to tend her." "Where is the healer? Where is she?" "The healer is gone. Now leave the tent before—" Gone? Had she not made it out of the fortress alive? If the healer was gone, then what hope was there for her? Delan hauled Kai to his feet, dragging him out of the tent, away from Aranya. "Don't you dare evanesce back there, boy. But she needs you to give the medics space to work. Now sit down. You're about to collapse." Kai didn't want to sit. He wanted to be at her side. He wanted to evanesce back into that tent. If he was about to lose her, he didn't want to be out here through it. But Delan grabbed his shoulders and shoved him down in front of a fire. "You've done all you can. Now we just have to wait. Wait and pray." Kai looked up at him, stricken. Delan's jaw was tight as a Jian string, his face haggard and exhausted, but his eyes flashed with determination. Suddenly, Kai didn't care about the spats they'd shared, the glares and the irritation. He realized he was looking upon one of the best men he'd ever known, a loyal warrior of the Empire, a man with a backbone of steel and a heart as soft as fresh snow. His magic wasn't anything special, but he was dependable, capable, and level-headed, no matter the disaster that struck. If not for Delan, they never would have made it through this. Kai didn't think he'd ever look at another man that he wanted to emulate, that he wanted to be like. He did now. He might have lost the rest of his family today, but he'd found a truer family. And all he could do was grip Delan's forearm and choke, "Thank you."
Chapter 34.
He hadn't thought it possible, but Kai fell asleep sitting up, waiting to hear Aranya's fate. Someone shook him awake, and Kai winced, only able to see a blob of orange fire and a blob of a silhouette he recognized as Delan. "I have news about Aranya," said Delan. Kai shot to his feet, a blanket he didn't know he had falling from his shoulders to the ground. "What? Can I go to her? Is she alive? Will she make it?" "She's lost a lot of blood, and there's been some internal complications that pose considerable risk. But she's stable." The torrent of relief sent him back to the ground, reeling. He nearly wept, covering his face with his hands. She's going to be fine, he whispered to himself. Kai, listen, sit up. The mission was accomplished. All the missing wielders still alive were recovered, every last one. The prisoners from the last failed battle were released. Fang's fortress has been destroyed. And my brother is dead, he thought. Then Zhenshu must have made it through the tunnel safely with his group. We're going back to Suguan, but the medics are concerned about Aranya's traveling in this state. She can't be left here. But going all the way to Suguan, traveling with such a slow party, they're afraid the journey will be too much. Kai nodded, swallowing, trying to blink away his emotions and master himself. What do they recommend? They recommend you take her back to Sushui. It's a shorter journey than Suguan, and it would be much swifter than traveling with a group of recovered prisoners. But of course, there is always risk. The journey still may be too much for her, or the countryside may prove too dangerous. I'll do it, said Kai immediately. Whatever is best for her. They said that if she takes a turn for the worse along the way, you need to find the nearest city and get help for her. Yes, of course. It's simply too dangerous to be this close to Fang's forces. Otherwise, the medics would say she shouldn't be moved. I understand. Delan stopped then, drawing in a deep breath and releasing it. Send updates to me in Suguan. I'll give you the address. I doubt I'll be able to sleep much until I know she's in the clear. Them both. Kai swallowed and nodded. When do we leave? Day after tomorrow, if she doesn't get worse. Get some sleep until then. Kai mounted his horse, the saddlebags full of provisions, medical supplies, and maps for the journey. Delan stood next to him, face tight and grim. They watched as Aranya was carried out of the medic tent in fresh clothes. She was either asleep or unconscious, and every trace of blood and grime had been washed off her. She will be fine. He just needed to get her home safely. They moved carefully, two of the medics lifting her into the saddle in front of Kai. They grimaced, as though they hated this last resort. Kai pursed his lips, wrapping one arm cautiously around her ribcage, her head lolled back against his shoulder. He would get her back. She would recover. With Aranya situated thus, he glanced one last time at the wielders packing up for their own journey. Not far away, Zhenshu was breaking down her tent, glancing up every few minutes at them. Some of the other rescued prisoners helped prepare for the journey to Suguan, while the rest were in the medic tent. They'd done it. Delan reached up and gripped Kai's forearm. Take good care of her. Kai only nodded. If she recovers. Delan trailed off, shaking his head, his brows furrowed, and he fixed Kai with his fiercest glare. You know you're never meeting a girl like her again, right? Don't blow your chance with her, idiot. At that, Kai's mouth twisted. No need to be worried about that. She's already head over heels for me. Delan's eyes narrowed. Get out of here. With that, he smacked the horse's rump, and the horse lurched into motion. Kai twisted back, angling to get one last glance of him. Delan stood, arms crossed and stocky legs planted sideways. He didn't wave, didn't shout goodbye. He only watched them go. Kai turned back in his saddle and faced the road ahead. Don't worry, Aranya. I'll get you home safely, he whispered into her hair.
The world was foggy, achy, and confusing. She tried to pry her eyes open, but they remained steadfastly shut. She tried to open her mouth, but her lips were likewise sealed. Slowly, she licked them, and even her tongue was dry. When she moaned, her throat burned. Then there was something behind her head, gently lifting her up. Something pressed against her lips, and warm liquid spilled into her papery mouth. She swallowed, then coughed, and the latter caused a spasm of pain in her midsection. She groaned again. Shh, careful now. Here, eat a little more. Finally, despite the agony, she peeled her eyes open. Evening light filled the small, familiar space, casting a shadow on the person sitting on the edge of the bed where she lay. His eyes were downcast, focused on the soup bowl he held against her lips. A stray hair fell over his brow. Kai, she croaked. His eyes snapped up to hers, wide and shimmering with flecks of hazel. Aranya! A relieved grin burst across his face, and suddenly those hazel eyes turned glassy. You're awake! What? Do you want some water? Here, let me get you some water. He wouldn't let her speak more until she downed several hearty gulps. Do you want to sit up more, or does it hurt too much? Hurt? She repeated blankly, then gingerly touched her aching side. Forget that. Don't sit up. You should stay down. Are you comfortable? Too hot or cold? She smiled weakly, wanting to chuckle, but the slightest movement to her abdominals sent shards of pain up her spine. Instead, she managed, What happened? Where am I? Kai seemed to hesitate, his eyes clouding over. You were stabbed by my brother Young. He's dead now, though, so he won't ever hurt you again. There was a tight grimness about his face, as if he were forcing himself to let go of dreamy ideals and face reality. The reality that his family would never be what he wanted them to be. I'm sorry, she whispered. He shook his head. Don't be. I'm just thankful I wasn't the one to kill him. What else happened? One of his eyebrows arched, and he looked away. Well, we won. Those wielders who had been vanishing the last 12 years were recovered, plus the other prisoners. I split off from the group to bring you home. The rest of them went back to Suguan. Home? Aranya gasped, lurching forward. Pain shot through her side, and she fell backward with a groan. Don't move. Here, you should take your medicine. Better now that you're awake than me trying to pour it down your throat. Kai got up, walking on long legs to the other side of the room. His back turned to her as the sounds of water pouring and the clinking of a utensil against a cup filled the small space. We're in Sushui? You've been taking care of me? For how long? Where are we? Wait! She gasped, a frantic thought hitting her like a ton of bricks. She forced herself up, a cry escaping her lips at the movement. Stay down, Kai demanded, evanescing to her side and preventing her from swinging her legs over the side of the bed. She bent over her core, one arm wrapped around herself as she gritted her teeth. You'll aggravate the wound. Here, take your medicine. It will help with the pain. Yeah, Aranya gasped. Is he all right? Is he alive? Kai blinked, then knocked aside her flailing hands and sat on the bed again. He caught the back of her head in his palm, bringing a cup to her lips. Of course, he's in your tenement. I told Na she didn't have to take care of him anymore. Forgive any presumption, but I gave her some money for her trouble. Just as an extra thank you. I've been taking care of him since we got back. We're in my tenement right now. I didn't want to put you back in your tenement because I wasn't sure how sensitive your grandfather was, and I thought it might be distressing for him to see you in your state. So I brought you here. He's all right, she said again, her eyes filling with relieved tears. Of course. I don't think I've heard a cat purr so loudly. As soon as you're ready, I can bring him to you. Now stop fussing and take your medicine. She obediently took her medicine, grimacing at the taste and its grittiness against her parched throat. He watched every sip and swallow as his fingers threaded through her hair. Delon, she croaked. I've informed him of your progress, that we made it back to Sushui, and I'm sure he will reply once he returns to Suguan. Speaking of which, a missive came for you. She waited as he got up again, the mattress shifting in the absence of his weight, and she clutched the cup of medicine he'd given her in both hands. He shuffled through a pile of paper on a low table on the other side of the room. The evening sun through the window caught the strands of his hair, making the dark edges turn gold, and illuminating the focused creases on his brow. He was so handsome. "Ah, here it is." He presented it with a dramatic bow, lifting his eyebrow and twisting his mouth into a smirk. "From the Secret Services themselves." "What?" "Read it." She did. Kai took the cup from her, freeing her fingers to clutch the white parchment. "Oh, payment for completing the assignment to be issued soon. I forgot all about that." "Keep reading." "Why? Did you read it?" she demanded. "No, I got one too." She eyed him suspiciously, but he only prodded her to keep reading. "We are pleased to offer you," she read aloud, blinking and staring at the page again. "Wait, they're offering me a position? With the Secret Services? In lieu of my wardenship here in Sushui?" Her mouth fell open. Kai was smiling. "It's quite the distinguished offer. Apparently on Delon's recommendation, no less." "And you got one too?" His smile turned cocky. "Of course." "Are you—" She hesitated, biting her lip. "Shall you accept it?" He sighed, then sat back down beside her on the bed. His legs spread wide, his forearms braced against his thighs as he stared at the opposite wall. She stared at his profile, trying to read it. "I'd like to," he said finally. "For the first time, I'm truly free to do what I want. Yong's gone. My mother is gone. My inheritance is gone, commandeered by Feng Zedong as his personal force of brigands. I don't—" He stopped, swallowed. Then he closed his eyes. "I don't have to hide anymore." Aranya wished she could lean down and lay her hand on his arm, but she couldn't move that far. "But I'm not. What I told you in the dungeon, I meant every word, Aranya." Color crept up his neck, his ears. "I'm not going to leave you. Well, of course, not unless you want me to. I'd leave then. I mean, I'm not going to force—" He seemed to realize he was babbling. He stopped, stared down at his hands. "I think you should accept it," she said. "If it's what you want, then that's what I want for you." "Does that mean you're not going to accept yours?" She shook her head, setting the parchment down on the bed beside her. "I cannot uproot Ye again. Besides, I've always wanted to be a warden. The secret mission was an adventure, one I'm all right foregoing for the time being. Maybe later I'll reconsider. But right now, these last few years, I want to spend them with Ye. I'm sorry if that complicates things for you." He was silent. Then he said, "Maybe I will just decline too. I'm sure someone nearby has need for an evanescer. I could find work—" No. You can't throw this opportunity away for me, Kai. You're an evanescer. This is a perfect fit for you and your magic. And I want you to be free to do what you want." "But I want to be with you, even if—" Kai. He glanced up, and she saw the mingled frustration and vulnerability on his face. She reached out a hand, unable to extend far enough to him. He glanced from her proffered hand to her, then interlaced his fingers with hers and squeezed. "It's just temporary," she said. "We can write and visit each other. And then, when the time's right—" He twisted, planting his knee on the bed beside her as he leaned over her. She swallowed, staring up at him, and then closed her eyes as he bent down and kissed her. "I love you," he whispered. She had never meant words more when she replied, "I love you too, Kai." He pulled back enough to arch an eyebrow at her. And if we're going to be a thing, then I get to kiss you as much as I want. Kisses punctuated the words, leaving her dazed. But she had the presence of mind to retort, as much as we want, Shikai, not just you. He flashed a devilish grin. Semantics. Then he climbed onto the bed beside her. Aranya grabbed the sheets, clutching them to her chest as a blush flooded her cheeks. What are you doing? This is highly inappropriate. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her tightly against his chest, ignoring the blanket she was wrapped up in, and nuzzled his face into her neck. Kai! She gasped, trying to sit up. It's only for a minute. You almost died, he groaned. I was so terrified that I'd lost you. Bringing you back was almost more terrifying. With those long days of travel, those long nights of watching you sleep and checking your pulse every hour. Please. I just want to hold you. With that, he held her tighter, pressed a kiss to her throat, and closed his eyes, letting out a deep sigh. Aranya laid there, momentarily stunned. He'd been that worried about her? As worried for her as she'd been for Ye. Something settled into her soul, and it was as though she'd spent her life running aimlessly through a vast forest, but at long last, she'd found what she'd always been looking for. Home. Aranya was forever home. She let her eyes drift shut as her body relaxed in Kai's arms. Peace was Kai's scent that filled her nostrils, his thumb as it traced the back of her neck and the curve of her ear. Home was the way he pressed his lips to her jaw and sighed, whispering, I'm so happy. I've missed you, love. She held on to him a little tighter. She wasn't ever letting him go. It must have been shortly after that when she fell asleep, because when she woke again, it was almost dark. Kai bent over her, another cup in his hand. Medicine time, he said. She wrinkled her nose. I just had medicine. It tastes gross. This is different medicine. You have a lot of medicines. I'd say this one will taste better, but it'll probably be worse. But once you've taken your medicine, I'll kiss you and make it better. He winked at her. She flushed despite herself, but accepted the draft and drained it in one horrid gulp. There, she gasped, setting into a painful fit of coughing. Now where's my kiss? He grinned, and with the way he kissed her then, she'd have drunk 1,000 cups of medicine. He pulled back, nuzzling her nose. Would you like to see your grandfather now? Chapter 35. Kai returned a few minutes later with a fluffy white bundle. Aranya sat up a little straighter, gritting her teeth to hide her grimace. Her heart pounded, nearly bursting with anticipation. Yeah, she cried. Kai smiled, then gently set the cat in her lap. Yeah began purring uproariously, sticking his wet little nose against her skin. He nuzzled into her chin, then her cheek, and she laughed as she scratched along his whiskers. He butted his head against her arm, her shoulder, curling his tail around her wrist and chirping. I'm not sure I've ever seen you so happy, Aranya said, laughing. I'm back now, and I'm not leaving again. Oh, I'm so happy to see you again. She swept him up into her arms, ignoring the pain, and hugged him as tightly as she could. Kai was on the opposite side of the room, quietly watching and smiling. She glanced from her grandfather to Kai, and she couldn't help the tears that began coursing down her cheek. Thank you, she mouthed to him. He made a kissy face with his lips in response, making her want to roll her eyes and blush. But in the wake of the cockiness, he gave her a sweet smile that threatened to bring more tears. After stretching and sticking his backside into the air, Ye hopped down from the bed and shapeshifted into his human form. Kai evanesced to his side, caught him behind the back, and gripped his hand. Here, you can sit here, he said, helping Ye down where he'd sat only a minute before. I'll be back after I get more firewood. Then I'm going to make you the best bowl of noodles you've ever had, and it will be just like old times. With that, Kai's eyes flicked up to meet hers, and then, with the silent promise to return soon in his hazel irises, he slipped out of the room. Aranya turned her attention to the hunched, grinning old man before her. His white hair and beard had grown long, but his eyes sparkled just as much as ever.
That boy. Oh, what was his name?
Kai.
Oh, well, that boy Yuhan.
Kai.
Yes, girl. So Yuhan was telling me that you shot at a Chilean alpha while you were gone.
She laughed. I shot at quite a lot of things while I was gone. I should tell you about the phoenix I took down.
Well, now, that's mighty impressive.
Aranya stared at him, realizing only now that she gripped his leathery hand. She lived for that smile lighting up his face.
I'm glad you're back, little sunflower,
he said. I'm glad to be back, too. Epilogue. He said that? To Qigong? Aranya gasped, hanging her jian on the wall of the ward-post armory. Months had slipped by in a constant stream of busyness since she'd recovered from her stab wound, though its scar would remain forever. She'd finally had time to organize the armory, with Qigong's permission, and it gave her great pleasure to see the weapons properly stored and cared for as they ought to be.
He did indeed,
Na replied, chuckling.
That poor new kid reminds me of you when you first showed up here.
Aranya winced. I don't want to think about the decisions I made back then. They made their way out of the armory as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting the flagstone courtyard in shadow. One of the best things about these past few months had been working with Na and becoming good friends with her.
When is Kai coming to visit?
Asked Na.
Hasn't it been over 2 months since his last visit?
It won't be for another month, and it's several days' journey from Suguan. But he writes to me multiple times a week.
Does he? I wouldn't have labeled him the type to write love letters.
Aranya gave a dry snort. You'd be surprised. Most of the things he writes are ridiculous nonsense, and his recent obsession is extravagantly silly pet names. I'm not sure if he just hates my name so much that he must call me by anything else. But even if I'm certainly not any wiser after reading his letters, they always brighten my day. That was an understatement. She lived for his letters, for his dramatic proclamations of love, until the day the grass turned blue and the sky turned green, for each new horrendous nickname. Most days she rolled her eyes, some days she laughed, and other days she cried. Every day she missed him. The letters and his promises to visit and his sweet kisses when he did finally visit were the only things that made the pain of this temporary separation bearable. She was due for a letter today, and she could hardly wait.
I'm glad to hear it,
Na said with a smile.
Are we still having noodles at your place tomorrow, like usual?
Always. As Aranya went to open the door leading back into the ward post, it swung open and nearly hit her in the face. She jumped back just in time and was met with Chen's expression that reminded her of a frazzled squirrel. She grinned.
Don't invite him,
muttered Na under her breath. Chen, you're coming over for noodles tomorrow, right? Chirped Aranya. And where is the new guy? He knows he's invited too, right?
Zhulong is talking to Qigong,
said Chen, wincing. Ah, said Aranya and Na together. They shared a meaningful look.
You should probably go rescue him, if you can, said Na. I'm heading out. See you tomorrow.
One rescue coming right up, muttered Aranya, waving to her fellow wardens and stepping into the ward post. No matter how much things had improved since she'd come back from her mission, Qigong's office remained her least favorite part of all Tsushui. She reached the sliding door and couldn't help her grimace when Qigong's irate tone drifted through the wood. A sigh slipped through her lips. Nevertheless, she lifted her hand and gave a hearty knock. Qigong's berating stopped. Then a short, "Who is it?" "It's Aranya, sir," she called.
"Come in."
Aranya slid open the door, stepped inside as the wood beneath her boots gave a loud creak. Qigong chewed his sugar grass between his fat lips, twirling his empty dragon teacup on the surface of his low desk. Before him stood a short, skinny young man, his shoulders shrunken as he took Qigong's rebuke. Aranya stepped to the new graduate's side and gave him a quick pat on the back. He glanced up at her, clearly relieved to see her.
"Just who I needed," said Qigong irritably, spitting out his grass and eyeing Aranya. "You can go, boy. Don't be late again tomorrow."
"Noodles, tomorrow. My place," Aranya whispered to the new warden. His countenance lifted, and he scurried out of Qigong's office, leaving Aranya standing before Qigong. She couldn't help but widen her stance as she faced her supervisor, clasping her hands behind her back as she waited with more trepidation than she wanted to admit. Why had he wanted to see her? Once the door closed, Qigong waved his hand vaguely after the boy.
"That Julong needs help. I tell you, these academy graduates get worse each year. The fate of our empire rests on the shoulders of idiots. I don't think I'll be comfortable dying and leaving one of them in charge."
Aranya only nodded, not speaking a word.
"I'll need you to take him on some of your routes. I need to make sure he's with someone I trust. Someone who knows what they're doing, or else who knows what manner of disaster he'll get himself into. So, if you could just take him under your wing for the next few months until he's adjusted, that would spare me a few gray hairs."
She couldn't help the way her lips quirked. "It would be my pleasure. And you're coming to my place for noodles tomorrow night, right?" "You need to stop inviting him," Na had said, "or one day he'll actually come." Apparently that day was not today.
"If I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times, I hate noodles. Besides, I spend all day with the lot of you. Evenings are my reprieve, for the father's sakes."
"Of course, forgive me. Anything else, Master Qigong?" He grunted and waved his hand in dismissal, leaving Aranya to spin on her heel and march out of his office. The moment the door was closed, she breathed a sigh of relief. That had actually gone well, if she dared say so. He wanted her to train the new warden. She left the ward post, letting the door swing shut behind her as her eyes adjusted to the glare of the sun. It was a little later than she'd hoped to get off, but thankfully Pong, a local boy with aspirations to apprentice himself to the apothecary, would be sitting with Ye until she got home. As nice as her full warden's salary was, the stipend she received from the Secret Services proved to be just what they needed, as Ye required more care with each passing month and couldn't be left alone. Without it, she would have had to quit her job to be with him all day, which didn't bode well for keeping food on the table. She took a deep breath right as a cart rolled by, kicking up dust and giving her a lungful of grit. She coughed, then squinted against the sun to find the steps so she didn't tumble into the street. That was when she noticed the tall figure lounging against one of the porch's posts, arms and ankles crossed like he had all the time in the world. Grinning teeth caught the sunlight. "Miss me yet, love?" Her heart gave a throbbing jolt. No, it couldn't be. He wasn't coming for another month. But she knew that voice, that stance. She would recognize him anywhere. Tears welled up. "Kai!" She broke into a run, only for him to vanish. The next instant, warmth flooded her back as a pair of strong arms encircled her waist from behind, and Kai's face nuzzled into her hair. "You need a bath," he whispered into her ear. As fast as they'd come, her tears disappeared. "Hey!" She struggled against his grip. "You haven't seen me in 2 months, and that is what you say first? If I stink so much, then let me go." Kai grinned, only tightening his arms around her, and pressed a kiss to her neck.
Not a chance.
His kiss made the fight go out of her. She slumped in his arms, then twisted around so she could embrace him back. He squeezed her so tightly she could hardly breathe, and all she could think was, "Home, home, I'm home." He leaned down and kissed her, long, lingering, and full of hope.
"I missed you, Partial."
"You can't call me that and expect me to say sweet things back to you." He grinned and flicked her nose, earning a scowl. "See, life is so much better when I can insult you to your face instead of via missive. Don't make me wish you'd stayed away."
"Don't be ridiculous, love. That is impossible."
Aranya huffed, but couldn't resist standing on her toes to give him one more kiss. That one kiss turned into another until she almost forgot she still stood on the ward post porch. Then a familiar voice drawled,
"Look, this is a beautiful reunion, but I have been patiently waiting my turn, and at this point, Kai is just being selfish."
Aranya's jaw dropped as Kai pulled away, lips twisted into a smirk.
"So, my coming early might not be the only surprise."
But Aranya was already stumbling out of Kai's arms and barreling straight toward the stocky, bearded wielder.
"Delon! 7 Valleys! You have no idea how much I've missed you!"
She nearly knocked him over with the force of her hug, and he had to reach out and grab the porch railing to keep from falling. Then he was hugging her back, and that was when Aranya learned Delon gave surprisingly good hugs.
"Glad to see you back to causing trouble,"
said Delon with a chuckle.
"I could hardly sleep a full night until Kai's letter arrived saying you were getting better."
He'd been that worried about her? She gave him one more squeeze before stepping back. Then she just stood there, looking between them like they might vanish into thin air if she looked away for too long. Perhaps Kai saw something in her expression, because he stepped to her side and wrapped an arm around her shoulder.
"So, are you going to ask why we're here?"
Aranya couldn't help her smile as Kai dragged her down the street with Delon toward her tenement. They kept to the side of the road, letting carts and people pass. "Why, pray, are you here in Sushui, Kai and Delon?"
"Can't tell you."
Kai winked at her.
"It's top secret." "In case you're wondering, yes, being on a mission with a lovelorn Evanescer is just as trying as it sounds," said Delon. "And despite what lies he fills your head with, our mission is not top secret and is, in fact, of hardly any importance at all. It's a routine surveillance of communication between cities and Suguan. Quite boring, actually. I take it that Kai didn't tell you that one of the cities we were assigned to was Tsushui."
No, he didn't. Aranya shot him a glare. He only grinned.
"I wanted it to be a surprise."
"Stop grinning so much, Kai. You look like an idiot."
"Can a man be happy to see his wife?" "She's not your wife, boy,"
said Delon at the same moment Aranya blurted, "I'm not your wife."
"She will be. Same difference."
Aranya rolled her eyes even as her cheeks heated. They turned onto her street, and her tenement with its wicker gate came into view. "How long will you stay then? Don't answer that, Kai. I don't trust anything you say right now."
"At least a week," said Delon. "Though I'm a little skeptical of how productive certain members of our party might be."
"A week? This is like a dream come true. You both will have to come over every night. And tomorrow night I'm making noodles for the wardens, so you'll have to come and meet everyone, Delon. Kai, I'm sure the rest would love to see you again."
"Have they had your noodles before?"
Kai asked in alarm. "Of course. We do this every week."
"Every week? Those poor wardens."
"You are just still sour because Yeah said mine were better than yours."
"Your grandcat can't taste the difference between noodles and foot."
"She, Kai—"
"Enough, enough!"
cried Delon, coming between them and shoving them apart.
Aranya, take us to your tenement. Kai, if you're so determined to prove your cooking skills, then you make us dinner tonight. I, on the other hand, would like to meet this yeah.
I'll warn you that his mind isn't what it was a few months ago, said Aranya. So don't be alarmed if he tells you he spent the day shopping or went to a wedding, or if he's missing his boat. Just ask him questions about his career or childhood, and he'll probably have comprehensible answers. It was hard, watching yeah slip away day by day. It was far more difficult than maintaining a long-distance relationship with Kai. And though the grief would never fully leave her, she didn't really want it to, truth be told. She was no longer afraid of the inevitable. Finding a family, one that extended beyond blood ties, made her stronger. When the day came for her to say her final goodbye to yeah, her sorrow would be great, but she wouldn't face it alone. That would make all the difference. It already had. Delon squeezed her shoulder.
Well, good, because I want to see if his account of Butagan aligns with mine. And to be clear, Kai and I will be staying at the local inn for the week, so we won't need a place to stay.
Oh, good, because if you wanted to stay with us, you'd have to sleep on the floor.
The floor sounds fine, said Kai. You are not staying with her, boy, growled Delon. Father, spare me. I'm not looking forward to chaperoning an Evanescer this week. I promise to be on my best behavior, said Kai. Don't lie to me. Nothing you say will make me lower my watch.
Kai evanesced from the opposite side of Delon's back to Aranya's side, bending down to whisper in Aranya's ear, "He's just jealous." Then he planted another kiss on the side of her face. She couldn't help but grin as warmth swelled in her chest. Home. Home was Kai's kisses. Home was Delon snapping,
"Jealous of what, boy? I'll remind you that I've been very happily married for many years now."
Home was the sound of the gate creaking open to her tenement, the groan of wood as the three of them walked down the hallway until they reached her familiar door. Home was the slow smile that spread across Ye's face when she entered and went to his bedside as Pong packed up for the day. Ye's voice was rough and weak, but still discernible as he squeezed Aranya's hand.
"Oh, you've brought Yuhan again."
Kai quirked a grin.
"Yuhan is about to make you some delicious noodles. And this time, you're going to agree that they're better than Aranya's. Understood? Delon will back me up."
Home was here. Home was now. And Aranya intended to savor every minute of it. This has been Warrior of Blade and Dusk, The Junning High Chronicles, Book 2, by Anastasis Blythe, narrated by Talon David and Lucas Arnold. Copyright 2022 by Anastasis Blythe. Production copyright by Anastasis Blythe.